This is the Gonzaga Socratic Club. If you haven't been before, you might not know that the Socratic Club isn't really a club. So there's no secret handshake, there's no initiation, hazing ritual, or anything like that. You just show up. The Socratic Club has existed on campus since, I think it's 14 years old now, so 14 years we've been going. But we get our name, the reason we have club in the name is we borrowed the name from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s. The Socratic Club at Oxford was started to provide a forum for people who are interested in talking about Christianity, both pro and con. So critics, famous critics of Christianity, atheists, philosophers like A.J. Ayer, presented papers at the Socratic Club at Oxford, and also theologians and apologists like C.S. Lewis himself often presented papers as well. But we take our sort of guiding approach. The Socratic part is to follow the argument wherever it leads. We're interested in questions about culture and philosophy, and that's what our talk today is going to be about. We meet about once a month. If you're interested in being informed about our events so that you can not miss the next one, we have a sign-up sheet for email listservs, so you're welcome to that. Our talk today is presented by Dr. Palma, the Computer Science Department here at Gonzaga. And I think of Dr. Palma as a humanist technologist. I don't know how you'd put those things together. In part, that's what your talk today is about, is questions about privacy and what it means to be a self, but relating that to technology. So the title, as you can see, is Private Lives of Cyborgs, Decay of Self, Melancholy of Scholars. I hope you will listen and take notes. We have plenty of time for conversation afterwards, and we'll have a commentator to kind of spur our discussion as well. But if you would, help me welcome Paul de Palma.
I hope my glasses are up here. I have this momentary anxiety. I would be lost. I'd have to talk with you. First, this is a funny format for me. You know, technical presentations are always done with PowerPoint. But I understand that in philosophy and literary circles, you read papers because you guys argue so carefully. So that makes me nervous right off the bat. Because I don't do that very much. So anyway, okay, all right, enough. So, all right, we have this extravagant title, The Decay of Self. Well, I stole that from Father Ong. In The Melancholy of Scholars, I stole that from Robert Burton. The Private Lives of Cyborgs is my own. Okay, well, here's Father Ong, an homage to Walter J. Ong, S.J. So everything that I'm going to say here is derived from Ong's work, and I'm glad he's dead and won't hear about this thing, because he will, I'm sure, would have been appalled at what I'm doing in his work. He was a great man, a great, great man. So, this is circa 1970. There he is in his books. I'll have a lot to say about him as we go along. My guess, maybe people will disagree about this, but I'm guessing he's probably one of the two most influential Jesuit scholars of the 20th century. People might put Teilhard de Chardin, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Lonergan.
Lonergan, yeah, it was Lonergan. Bernard Lonergan and Ong, I would say, probably. Well, the last time I gave a talk like this, I could not restrain myself, and I just began yakking. So really, every time you see me look up, say, pay attention. Read. All right. I've always thought that technology is kind of silly. I mean, Twitter, really? I mean, that's to be taken seriously, you know? This is my affliction, S.T.S. Eliot once said about more weighty matters. I even wrote a couple of articles a while back for the American Scholar arguing just that technology is silly. I don't remember when I began to think of computing as ominous. maybe it was when I realized that Google wasn't just giving us those neat search engines because old Larry and Sergey were good guys. Anyway, over the next couple of years, I kept wondering what Father On would have to say about Twitter and all the rest. A few years ago, I had a sabbatical, well, a couple of years ago, I had a sabbatical coming up. And I got myself an appointment at the Walter J. On, the S.J. Center for Language, Culture, and Media Studies at St. Louis University. And in some half-baked way, I thought that just being near the Ong archives, maybe even looking at Father Ong's handwritten notes would give me the answer. And it did, kind of. But instead of digging into the archives, I began rereading, and reading for the first time, in some cases, his enormous, really an enormous body of work that went on for 50 years. Also, I had a lot of time in my hands, and I was in this big research library. And I'll get back to that when I talk about the melancholy of scholars, what that really means. But I wandered around and I wandered around and I read some more and I wandered around and my wife wasn't there, so I didn't have to be home at night, and I just had nothing to do but wander about this dictionary, this library all day. And I relearned, because I used to want to be this kind of scholar, I relearned what it is that scholars do if they don't spend their lives entangled in the gorgeous but context-free intricacy of computer programs. Well, they get lost in books, as it happens. Anyway, I think I know now why fully, this is honestly not true, fully 1/3 of the world's population has become gladly, willingly, enthusiastically the most surveilled people in all of human history. But I'd like to start with a signal revelation for me. So let's see if this part works. We all know who he is. I can't stop thinking about this guy. But it's mostly this beautiful, beautiful email that he wrote to Laura Partris, the director of the film. We all know who Citizen4 is, yeah? Okay. Let's see if we can get the trailer anyway. It's just beautiful.
I'm voting for better jobs and better economy.
We're voting for women's rights.
Common sense gun law. For the LGBTQIA+ community. Voting matters. Voting matters.
Voting matters.
Es importante votar. Laura, at this stage I can offer nothing more than my word. I am a senior government employee in the intelligence community. I hope you understand that contacting you is extremely high risk. For now, know that every border you cross, every purchase you make, every call you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, friend you keep, site you visit, and subject line you type is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited, but whose safeguards are not. In the end, if you publish the source material, I will likely be immediately implicated. I ask only that you ensure this information makes it home to the American public. Thank you, and be careful. Citizen4.
So I don't know anything about you.
Okay. Back to G squared. Okay. Well, listen to that. I mean, listen to the language first. I mean, that's what won me with this thing. It wasn't what he was talking about, although that was important. It was the language. Listen, the system is alive, whose reach, he says, and omniscient. It's unlimited. But more importantly, it's a thing of beauty. Did you hear how beautiful that was? And it just begs to be read aloud. And I will later on in this talk. I'll read his little email out loud. It's poetry in my view. What the spoken word has to do with privacy really is the subject of this talk. But I'd like to state the problem more clearly. A recent article in an important computer science journal reports that very few users, as indicated by their searches, are looking into what the writer called privacy-enhancing technologies. There was a brief interest just after the Snowden revelations, but since then, attention has reverted to what else? Sports and celebrity gossip. Honestly, this is the truth. You know, the question is why. So here's the executive summary. Go home. The notion of a private self is historically contingent. The private self emerged in the early modern period. Prior to its emergence, were a set of mental dispositions that are communal in nature. And these mental dispositions are beginning to reappear. And that's what I wonder why. Despite all of this talk about break-ins at Facebook, Facebook is doing just fine, as is Mark. He's not losing any money. So the issue is why? Why? It turns out I don't care either, as it happens. And I don't know why that is. So let's move this. Okay, well, this is my notion, the communal self, circa 1300 AD. And this is from this gorgeous 13-volume set called The History of the Private Life. It's gorgeously illustrated. It's in the library. I would recommend this stuff. The community that defined the boundaries in which the individual moved, whether rural village, town, or urban neighborhood, was a familiar world in which everyone knew and kept an eye on everyone else. Outside lay a terra incognita, peopled by figures of legend. The only inhabited space, the only space subject to the rule of law, was communal space. Okay. Let's just begin by acknowledging that our ancestors were different from you. Well, how about this? This is a text we all know, of course, from the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, that's crucial, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Can you imagine such a right being codified today? The Fourth Amendment might as well have been cooked up by visitors from outer space. And I don't mean this for civil libertarian reasons. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's not being enforced properly or anything like that. I'm saying that we would not do such a thing today if we were in charge of putting things together. I mean that 21st century Americans are as different from James Madison with the Federalist Papers and the Fourth Amendment as Madison was from the inhabitants of medieval Europe. If we are to believe the artifacts left by a swath of peoples from classical times to the early modern period, the assumption that each of us has an inner life, a consciousness inaccessible to any other human being without our direct mediation did not begin to form until a few hundred years ago. Says Montaigne, you know, the great essayist of the 16th century, if I had lived among those nations which, they say, yet dwell under the sweet liberty of nature's primitive laws, I assure thee I would most willingly have painted myself quite fully and quite naked. Thus, reader, myself in the matter of my book. Although Montaigne did not present himself fully or either fully or naked, he did acknowledge the existence of a self that might be fully and nakedly presented, and in so doing prepared humankind's stony soil for those extraordinary tillers of the inner life who would arrive over the next few hundred years. How about this one? Does anyone know this one? I love this one. I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Are you nobody too? How dreary to be somebody. How public like a fraud. The next line, although I don't have it here, I have to say it to you. To tell your name the livelong day to an admiring dog. Writes Emily Dickinson. A thought unthinkable in a medieval village. Well, how did the self emerge? How did Emily Dickinson appear? And why, roughly at the same time, is the 19th century novel, with its omniscient access to the inner workings of Anna Karenina's heart? Well, Father Ong offers a clue. Walter Ong was a rhetorician and media historian, mining the same vein as Marshall McLuhan, though in a much more scholarly fashion. For those of a certain age, that is my age, Marshall McLuhan needs no introduction, though maybe a bit of a reminder since he's fallen from view in recent decades. He was the unlikeliest of celebrities. He was an English professor whose work went viral. Can you imagine? That was bizarre, actually, isn't it? He even had a part in Annie Hall. I mean, that, you know, the marker of Alderman Hippia's 70s style. A very funny part. You should just go home tonight and rent that movie and watch it. He's great. McLuhan invented the term global village, 3 decades before its commercial and ideological reincarnation as globalization. Well, Awn was a student of McLuhan's at St. Louis University in the 40s, and probably at McLuhan's suggestion, and under the direction of the Americanist Perry Miller, he did his dissertation on Peter Ramus, a 16th century French logician, intellectual systematizer, and pedagogical theorist, himself a celebrity. Though Ramus's work is entirely forgotten, it lives on in the row column structure of classrooms, which we don't see much anymore, which is worth noting. I'll get back to that. Peter Ramus was the Thomas Piketty. Oh, how they disappear. We don't even hear about Thomas Piketty. He's fallen back into obscurity. But 2 summers ago, you couldn't listen to any of it. Piketty was everywhere. Piketty, 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 Piketty. Reminds me of that. Higgledy, piggledy. Anyway, he was everywhere. We come, we go, you know, we get our 5 minutes of fame. Peter Ramus was the Thomas Piketty of the late 16th century, an endlessly discussed, highly internationalized, lingua franca speaking public intellectual. Between 1550 and 1650, 750 separate editions of Peter Ramus's work appeared, and along with his collaborator, Omar Taleb. In Ramus's work and in his enormous pedagogical influence, Awn found an exemplar of a developing set of mental habits that represented a new way of seeing the world and imagining himself. Well, what are these habits that Ramism encouraged? Above all, they form a critique for the clear visual presentation of any subject through the division of the general to the particular, mostly in groups of twos. Anyone who's ever seen a Renaissance text will have found such a division. So here is one from just really my all-time favorite book, The Anatomy of Melancholy from 1631, Robert Burton. So this is one of 3 partitions, but you can see this elaborate table of contents that's worked up here. By the way, those of us at a certain age also learned to write this way. We were told that we should work up our essays in advance. Are you still told that? Were you guys told that? A foolish idea. It worked in 1588. It was revolutionary, actually. A revolutionary idea. Tables, this is stunning to me, and it had to be pointed out. Tables of contents, indices, and pagination itself are all technologies, every one of them. And none of them were available until the invention the adoption of letterpress printing. So they're every bit as clever and far-reaching as any iPhone app. And just like that iPhone app, they all depend upon underlying hardware, every one of them. And I thought I'd do a little picture of letterpress printing and of these things. But look at that guy over there on the right. So that's the box of the fonts themselves. And this is what made the mass production of books possible. That's how Omar Taleb and Peter Ramus could publish all of those books, because they didn't have to load up his printer every time with carvings, for instance. Okay. So as long as we're doing that, we should compare that to a manuscript. Gorgeous things, you know. But manuscripts are exactly that, manuscripto, handwritten. They're handwritten. And however beautiful they might be, they cannot be made uniform without great effort. In fact, it is their beauty that precludes regularity. The Ramist insistence that intellectual work could be anatomized, and that's an important word, anatomized, that is divided and subdivided, is only one instance of an increasing use of spatial metaphors to model metaprocesses in the early modern period. The very word I've used, anatomized, as a metaphor for physical visual dissection was in fact, as it happens, all the rage in the 16th. Do you ever think of things being all the rage in the 16th and 17th century? When I wrote that, I started laughing. But they were all the rage. For example, I just dug up a few. Euphues, the anatomy of wit, the anatomy of abuses. English majors used to have to read some of these things. And then, of course, the anatomy of melancholy. And I'm told, although I'm not a Latinist, that this vast, vast Latin literature of the early modern period was even fonder of this use of the word anatomy. Occurring at roughly the same time was the development of diagrammatic logic, visual perspective in painting, and a reorientation of space itself in the Copernican model of the solar system. So I thought this one was kind of nice because you could see this perspective in painting that if you walk through an encyclopedic art museum, you know that this begins to appear about this time, the late 15th century. I'm sorry, yeah, late 15th century, early 16th century. This one is especially poignant because it is a painting of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which Peter Ramus himself was murdered. It was an attack of Catholics on French Calvinists, Huguenots. And the tale of the Protestant Reformation will come up later in the story. Okay. I said this what was going on during this period among many other things was this reconceptualization of space. So Copernicus deserves particular attention. The Copernican model, unlike certainly the way I was taught, I don't know how you all were taught, but the Copernican model was not a presentation of new observations. It was a spatial reconceptualization of existing data, a kind of Occam's razor applied to the Ptolemaic epicycle, that little thing you see in the middle there. Why exactly did planets exhibit this, or do planets exhibit this retrograde motion at certain times of the year? Answer, try imagine looking at the planets sitting on the sun, and they don't do that anymore. It's utterly clever, right? Utterly clever. So this Copernican revolution was really, as much as anything else, a revolution in the production and distribution of books, especially technical books with mathematical and astronomical tables. I like this next one too. Regularity across copies also made possible that fixture of all engineering and science texts, the technical illustration coupled with an explanation. Before there were mass-produced books identical across copies, it was impossible to have anything like that. I'm sorry that I don't have any text there, but this would have existed with text surrounding it on both sides. And the reason why is because manuscripts differ subtly from copy to copy to copy until, in Ogg's words, a piece of white asparagus begins looking like, by copy 17, a sprig of clover. And in some ways, because the mass distribution of now these technical tracts was possible, science for the first time was possible. So we make much of Francis Bacon and make much of the scientific method, but I think the secret is right here. It's in the production and distribution of books. When Copernicus was a boy, or a young man anyway, in the late 15th century, he probably couldn't get his hands on a copy of the Almagest, Ptolemy's work. By the time of his death, 60 years later, he owned 3 separate copies. So, the Almagestum, 1550. Well, all right. Since Peter Ramus is where Ong began, let's look at the problem he confronted and its visual solution in the mechanized production of books. You think I'm not going to get back to tweet, don't you? But I am. We're going to get back there. We're just going to go on this journey in outer space and come back to tweet. All right. Ramus probably studied a text much like this one from Peter of Spain, his Sumulae Logicales, when still a boy, though in Latin, of course. And this is worth reading out loud. The second rule is that a proposition concerning the infinite, taken syncagrammatically, is expounded by a copulative whose first part affirms the predicate of the subject taken according to some. You see what I mean? I mean, it's incomprehensible, right? It is incomprehensible. Ramus invented this method of subdivision. Really, what this thing needed was logical and mathematical notation, but this didn't come until much later. But Ramus invented a method of visual subdivision that appears in his training in dialectic. And you can see we have the argument there and the assumptions down here at the bottom. We divide these things in parts and parts and parts, and all intellectual work can be dissected this way. So Peter Ramus told us. Ramus and Ramus-inspired diagrams were teaching tools, efforts at taming the stunning complexity of scholastic logic. They also allowed the master to invite his students to look at a particular word. This one is big. Isn't it? I'm inviting you to laugh at my jokes. This one is really big. They also invited the master. They also allowed the master to invite his students to look at a particular word in a particular book, on a particular page, at a particular time, something that never happened in all of human history. Why? Because the copies were irregular. And they were also really expensive, but they were irregular. So here we have it. There's a guy there at the top, and everybody's looking at his book, and there's one of my students over in that corner. To me, this is just stunning. Anyway, the cultural artifacts made possible through the development of mental habits of visual analysis and spatial modeling did not end with Gutenberg, Copernicus, and Ramus. These in turn reinforced visual thinking whose consequences can be found everywhere. The Protestant Reformation, for instance, had its symbolic beginning 5 centuries ago when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. This signal event is still celebrated. A couple of years ago, I went to a concert that was celebrating this event. There it is. Except that it didn't happen that way. What Luther did do was have his theses printed up and distributed to the superiors of his Augustinian order and to the Bishop of Albrecht. Over the years, Luther became a prolific writer. His work, running to 73 volumes, would not have been possible without printers across Northern Europe who met the demands of an increasingly literate public for all things Lutheran. And what did he do with those 73 volumes? Much, of course, but boiled down, freed from his personal torments and battles with demons, one of whom he found in his bed disguised as a dog. He wrote that the individual Christian achieves redemption by faith alone, that is, by some internal disposition of the self. And that this quest is guided by sola scriptura, Scripture alone. This last bears repeating, Scriptura. Writing becomes a metonym for the Bible, the sole source of spiritual guidance. The appearance of mechanized printing allowed Luther to claim that salvation was only available to the struggling, questioning, agonizing self, and the sole guide through all that anguish was text. The association couldn't be clearer. And then, I'm stunned by this. Listen to an evangelical talk radio someday. I have been, by the way, in recent weeks, to avoid the madness of the day. And then you'll hear, if you'll hear, it's unbelievable, there you'll hear the planet's remaining readers debating what St. Paul meant in 2 Corinthians when he wrote, "The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life." I think of them as courageous defenders of the word's last readout before drowning in the tsunamic orality of social media. By the way, the Northern European witch craze of the 15th and 16th centuries is also book-related, but that's a subject for another time. The differences between speech and writing the consequences for those living in a literate as opposed to a pre-literate world are monumental. The spoken word is heard, the written word is seen, and crucially, seen alone. And this is how Ong put it 50 years ago. The word in its natural oral habitat is part of a real existential present. Spoken utterance is addressed by a real living person to another real living person at a specific time in a real setting, which includes almost much more than mere words. In a text, text, like before text, you know what I mean? In a text, even the words that are there lack their full phonetic qualities. The writer's audience is always a fiction. The writer must set up a role in which absent and often unknown readers can cast themselves. Writing favors the visual over speech and hearing, and in this visual sense, the setting up of context through writing, or this reconstructing of context through reading, a self develops, capable of defining itself against all those other probable selves one encounters in the world. Well, listen, believe me, Father Ong never wanted to acknowledge this, but a lot more was going on in the early modern period in the development of the book. One of which was the increasing power of the state over central affairs. The peace of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War, and in effect, the setting up of the sovereign state occurred in 1648. But the response of the self to changing circumstances can be found in courtesy books, also all the rage in this period, that formed an important part of popular and pedagogical literature in the early modern period, a kind of mismanners of the courtly life. These chronicle the transition from things once done in public, but increasingly constrained to the private sphere or monopolized by the state. Things like prohibitions on the extravagant public violence once exercised by the knightly warrior class. The state has a monopoly on violence, and this was not always the case. We think that this just makes sense, right? That they get to execute people and put them in prison and do all kinds of hideous depredations to them. But this was not always the case. You might have done it, Brian, if you were sufficiently aggrieved. Anyway, okay. Increasingly constrained to the private sphere. Things like prohibitions on extravagant violence, on touching or looking at one's dining companions, or advice about nose blowing and spitting. And this is taken in translation, of course, from from an Erasmus, from Erasmus, little book giving advice to young people on how to grow up. And he says, "Turn away when spitting, lest your saliva fall on someone." They had to be told that. I mean, it wasn't obvious. You know what I mean? It was not obvious. Okay. The appearance of private diaries in the late 16th century. Diaries don't appear. No one ever thought of writing "Dear Diary" before about 1550 or so. The appearance of private diaries in the late 16th and early 17th centuries is an especially good example of the evolving self. The distinction here is between writing about oneself, a long-standing practice, think St. Augustine, and writing for oneself. In the personal diary, the writer and the audience are one. An extraordinary development, actually, if not signifying a self that did not previously exist, signifying one now available for anatomization. Another practice that developed in this period, so internalized for us that it might be difficult to believe that it once did not exist, is silent reading. As late as the 14th century, reading was still done almost entirely in public and then frequently by professionals. After the 16th century, however, silent reading became quite dominant. How do we know? Well, houses from this period were frequently built with private reading rooms, chapels of the mind, so to speak, where oneself might reflect on another, expressed in this oddest of inner voices, the written word. The invention of silent reading has to stand as a, I'm asserting something, I'm not embarrassed when I'm saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I asked them sometime what constitutes evidence in English studies, and somebody said, this woman said to me, well, you can't be obviously wrong, and you have to be kind of entertaining. So that's good for me. I like that very much. The invention of silent reading has to stand as a monumental cultural transformation, a dramatic instance of making private what was once public. Ong, as always, said it earliest and best. And here's Ong. I love him. I love this picture. He's in a cassock. Priests used to wear cassocks, and he's involved there in his own interiority. He was great. Since pure interiors, persons, do communicate with one another so largely by voice, the silencing of words portends in some way withdrawal into oneself. Because it consists of silent words, writing introduces a whole new set of structures within the psyche. Communication which lacks the normal social aspect of communication. Encounter with one who is not present. Participation in the thought of others without commitment or involvement. The contemporary... Am I running out of time here? I think I should wrap up, shouldn't I? Nope?
You're good.
Okay, good, because I'm warming to the topic. The development of a self to be cherished, indulged, protected, idealized even, reached escape velocity in the early 19th and 20th centuries. Many of the tropes that focus on the individual self, the artist, the intellectual, the rebel, the adolescent, along with distinctive first names, full-length mirrors, private mail, and domesticity, were 19th century inventions. Domesticity, that notion that the home is the locus of the private and intimate relations, achieved almost cult status during the Victorian period. Here's Dickens in Great Expectations. There's this character, John Wemmick, who says, he lives in a castle. He made a mock castle. He lives in this castle. He pulls up this drawbridge at night, and he says, work is one thing, and private life is another, he says. When I go into the office, I leave the castle behind me. And when I come into the castle, I leave the office behind me. The contemporary custom of work at home, emails on the commuter train, and texts everywhere, enabled by a worldwide network of cell phone towers, etc., have broken down the distinction between public and private. At the same time, they have destroyed, utterly destroyed, the rather quaint notion that communication between individuals is a private matter, to be abridged only with a court order. Consider the disappearance of telephone booths, once fixtures in public places. Phone booths, by the way, played a role in the 1967 Supreme Court decision where the justices laid out a reasonable expectation of privacy. That is what you could expect in a phone booth. What do we do now? They don't exist anymore. But I thought, just for those who have never seen one, there they are. Yes, okay. To underscore the malleability of the human perceptual apparatus, let's turn to the state of affairs before the development of letterpress printing. In a pre-literate culture, you know only what you remember, what you just heard, or what is stored in collective memory through proverbs, stories, and epic poems. You've never looked anything up, because once spoken, it goes out of existence. In fact, the Bible, in its King James or Douay version, seems so, well, poetic because it was produced in what Ong calls massive oral residue. Get the sense here. And think of, I'd like you to think of what Snowden had to say. Think of the cadence of his email. In the beginning, God created the world and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And this, I mean, it's gorgeous. This is beautiful. This is, you don't have to be an evangelical to be enthusiastic about reading this text, right? You should wake up each morning and say, this is for me. Okay. We read this text and we know that we are in the presence of something very, very old. And not just because it's God's word, The sense of antiquity in this and other oral tales, recast in print, comes from the use of rhetorical devices, repetition here, that are both mnemonic aids and reflective of the much simpler syntactic structures found in speech as opposed to writing. English legal writing, with its piling on of words, which means essentially the same thing, cease and desist, is a carryover from late medieval common law, developed in a culture that, though literate in a technical sense, was still overwhelmingly oral. Rhyme, of course, in epic poetry and elsewhere supports memorization. Without writing, it's impossible to develop an extended argument. Imagine mathematics, for example, formal logic, or even the argument that I'm trying to make here, which is why I'm writing it down, without the existence of writing. The Russian psychologist A.R. Luria shows us a world that was already going out of existence when he encountered it in Siberia in the 1930s. To test whether his illiterate subjects were able to perform logical operations, he presented them with the first two terms of a syllogism and asked them to conclude the third. I love this thing. In the far north, where there is snow, all bears are white, says Luria. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north, and there is always snow there. What color are the bears? Says an 18-year-old illiterate peasant, I don't know. I've seen a black bear. I've never seen anyone. I've never seen any others. I'll tell you a secret about this story. Okay. Nearly every aspect of contemporary human culture has been made possible by writing. From the obvious, like the novel, to the less obvious, like classical music. As Maurizio Ferraris, who Kurt told me about, has observed, every social object in a literate culture leaves a written trace. Social objects in the Ferraris ontology are just those things that are registered. Things like marriages, shared custody arrangements, prison terms, the dollar-euro exchange rate, degrees, the meaning of a signature, the notation for Bach's fugue in C-sharp major, architectural plans for the Junt Center, and the names of the students in my computational linguistics class. None are possible without writing. So here's the question I began with. Why don't we fight back against intrusions on our privacy by surveillance cameras and by governmental and commercial data collection? And here's my answer. A self so tightly contained that its violation would generate outrage is going out of existence. The self took a very long time to cohere, at least 4,000 years. We find evidence of it in the changing modes of cultural expression, in the death of the epic, and the birth of the novel, the death of the oral tale, and the birth of the diary, in the death of rhythmic poetry, and the birth of blank verse, in the birth, and now death, it seems, of classical music. We also find the developing of self in courtesy books of the early modern period, shifting emphasis on proper and controlled behavior at court, in their advice to privatize the spitting, farting, nose-blowing, eye contact, and smiling that had once been dinner behavior. We find evidence of the constrained self in Victorian and Edwardian dress, in men and women swathed from head to foot in cloth and leather. The self has been breaking free for a long time now. Many are aware, wrote on in 1971, of the marked orality of our culture today when compared with the culture of 30 years ago, before the electronic potential, first mobilized in the 1840s with the telegraph, had matured and become interiorized in lifestyles and worldviews. Ong called this phenomenon secondary orality. He noticed that changes in the culture, including informality in speech and writing, a turning outward from the interiorized self of silent reading, and a growing spontaneity. Once this retreat from interiority and formality is pointed out, and I'm pointing it out to you, you'll find it everywhere. At drive-through prayer services, for example. But not just there. In Mass on Sunday morning, when you see middle-aged men dressed in jeans, you know, like me, all the time. The classroom offers a dramatic example. Foucault wrote Discipline and Punish in the 70s, casting classrooms as prisons. Since then, the classroom has been flipped. Professors taught less and hear more. What would have stunned Father Ong, including students' opinions at the end of the semester. I'm sorry, I'm going to resurrect him just to hear that. Father Ong, guess what? I get to tell you what I think about you. It's unbelievable to me. But there it is. Turns out it's a better world, but we'll get on to that. In the past decade, a former senator has appeared in a Viagra ad. Unbelievable, right? A vice presidential candidate coyly winked at the audience during a foreign policy interview. You know who. A sitting president was the author of a widely praised account of his struggles with ethnic identity, something that would never have been done 60 years ago. Never. No president would have admitted that there were any struggles going on. In fact, there was any self to struggle. The once dour New York Times published a confessional series on the efforts of one woman to get off her psychiatric meds. That's true. 10 things I'd tell my former medicated self. And the word memoirist, I love this term, memoirist, has been coined to describe a writer whose profession is to produce serial confessional biographies. And I'd give worlds to hear Father Ong on this. A reality TV star is our president. These are simple observations, and I assure you, I make no judgment about this. To trivialize Yeats on the Easter 1916 uprising, all has changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. What is born is a new willingness to lay open the self so carefully constructed, so deeply hidden since the early modern period. We are different people from those enjoined by the courtesy books of the 15th century to refrain from blowing our noses on tablecloths. This is not a judgment. It is no more than an earnest attempt to make sense of the puzzling events around us. Why are more people interested in LeBron James and Caitlyn Jenner than when Snowden told us about the NSA? Or what we certainly know about Facebook? My answer is that the emergent self of the early modern period has eroded under pressure from the electronic media and its relentless informality and person-centeredness, but also because the central state power that made the courtesy books of the 15th century so important has loosened its grip on certain behaviors, now thought to be purely private, which, paradoxically, turn out to be not so private at all, only beneath the notice of the state. Now listen to Snowden again. For now, know that every border you cross, every purchase you make, every call you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, friends you keep, site you visit, subject line you type, is in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited, but whose safeguards are not. This is true. I know this is going to sound silly. No, I won't even say that. I can hear the repetitions found in native chant. House made of dawn, house made of the evening light, house made of dark cloud. And in Genesis, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let there be firmament, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. And in Shakespeare, fear no more the heat of the sun, fear no more the frown of the grape. And in Christopher Smart, for I will consider my cat Geoffrey, for he is the servant of the living God, for at the first glance of the glory of God. And even in that most literate of poets, T.S. Eliot, let us go then, you and I, let us go through certain half-deserted streets. There will be time for you and time for me. Each passage, including Snowden's, shares the power of the spoken word. For poetry is magic, says Auden, born in sin. Better yet, poetry is born before sin, born in that prelapsarian dream before we humans learn to write, and through writing, learn to know our meanings. And through print, learn to attend to those meetings in private. Meetings which are now as public as any cell phone conversation. If you need to.
It is often the practice at the Socratic Club that we have a commentator to help spur discussion, and our commentator for today is a longtime fixture here at Gonzaga, Dr. John Caputo, in the Leadership and Communication Department, and a scholar on Palma.
He's the Walter J. Ong Scholar, as a matter of fact. Is that not right?
Yeah.
That's John's title.
Yeah. That was great. That was really great. In turning some of the private into the public, I want to say a few things before I share my few comments. I have a long history with Paul. I've known him for quite some time. We were born within maybe 15 miles of each other, baptized by the same bishop, lived across country, but we didn't meet till our first day at Gonzaga University in around 1989-90, whatever year we showed up here, and then learned a little bit about our history, became fast friends, something in common about our ancestry, Italian-American heritage, and so on. And in fact, Paul and I had a radio show for a while called Two Guys from Ohio, and it was a cooking show on KYRS, and we had that show. And also, I read some versions of this paper because Paul's been working on this paper about Walter Ong for a Bologna conference in Italy 2 or 3 summers ago. And with Kirk Besner and Paul, myself, Father Tim Clancy, several other Gonzaga faculty, we hosted a Walter Ong conference here a few years back. So that history colors some of my thinking about Paul and our interactions about this that emerge a little bit from the paper and what I'd like to say about the paper. I actually read the paper, so the oral part was I was listening to it, but you got delivery in a very different sense than I did, which obviously, as you hear with this understanding of speech and language and written and oral, this is all part of how we take things in. I think Paul writes a wonderful paper full of questions about the significance of rhetoric in understanding contemporary humankind. He leads the reader through several intellectual traditions to find the tributaries that support the writings of Walter Ong and cultural change. And he comes to believe that we are becoming different people, particularly as it relates to privacy and technology in the 21st century. Communication theorists, cultural anthropologists have done the courtesy of previously plowing these fields to open up a historical review of communication and culture. Harold Ennis, Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, James Carey, and anthropologist Edwards appear among them. James Burke does a great job of sharing this perspective in the PBS series, The Day the Universe Changed. If you've not seen that, it's old now, but you can still find it on YouTube. All the various episodes of The Day the Universe Changed, because he's looking at the history of communication, and with each cultural revolution, there's a significant change in society. If you think about the word revolution, we're talking about total upheaval based on what's occurring. The 6 communication revolutions are identified, suggesting these periods or events radically altered our societies, our world. Those revolutions start with the notion that humans were not born with the capacity for speech or capacity for language. We were nonverbal animals. And in that society, the development of language and speech happened way thousands of years later after humans are already here. We didn't have the right brain, we didn't have the right vocal apparatus, we could not create speech. But we could have a symbol system, we had a semiotic symbol system, we had the potential for developing communication, and that took thousands of years to develop. Those revolutions start, as I said, thousands of years later we develop our capacity to write, because we go from nonverbal to oral to written. By the 14th century, movable type is invented and a whole string of new communication technologies develop around this process. McLuhan writes, these extensions of man really extend our human nervous system into a technological embrace. So he talks about these extensions of human potential, humans' semiotic potential. By the 20th century, the capacity to spread duplicate messages through multiple channels moves us into the electronic age, and currently we are now in the age called the digital era. Edward Sapir talks about the seamless web of user and use. Do we use communication media, or do media use us? And perhaps we gain and give up parts of ourselves, as Postman describes what he calls his Faustian bargain in technopoly. I quote, "All technological change is trade-off. I like to call it a Faustian bargain. Technology giveth, technology taketh away. This means that for every advantage a new technology offers, there is always a corresponding disadvantage." Always. And this is where Paul leads the reader in questioning how technology, moving from oral to written culture to print culture and now to visual, digital cultures, question what Paul's willing to ask, are we willing to give up our privacy? Why are we willing to give up our privacy for this? Paul posits that privacy is historically contingent. Artifacts since the Greeks suggest an inner life and a self does not begin to form until the early modern period. Maybe. Paul argues through his readings of Felipe Reis that by the 16th century a new boundary was being drawn between the private and the public. He looks at literacy, a centralized state of government, local control, and the inward and pietistic forms of religious expression after Protestant Reformation, that print culture made these things possible. They weren't possible before that time. Maybe. He states pre-literate humans are not like you and me. Maybe, maybe not. So who is this personal self that values or doesn't give a damn about privacy? Or, Paul fears, doesn't even think about it. Who is that person? Who are we? Right? Why are we not outraged by many intrusions upon our privacy? Why do we create avatars on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, etc., of our idealized selves? This is a moment of reflection. Why do we do that? Why do you do that? Why do I do that? And who is the who we present there? What is that self? How much of that self is our, to use Paul's terms, interior self? And how much is that our idealized self, which is really just sort of a hope of who we could be or what we could be? Most of us write about the fun that we're having on some of those sources, right? We don't really write when we have not having fun, because who cares when I'm not having fun? A new rhetoric beyond secondary orality, I believe, is in process. Ong's work about secondary orality I find a bit dated to kind of go into with the new rhetoric that's being developed. What are the rules we should follow and who sets them? I recently read that loneliness can be deadly and one of the primary indicators of significant health problems in the elderly, but actually throughout our lifespan. So the melancholy of scholars, the loneliness of each of us in our daily lives, perhaps something else is going on. If this process of communication is one in which communication is the intention of the sender and the perception of the receiver, any fidelity between sender and receiver is quite coincidental. The truer question may be about how we create this social reality in which we live, and the number of selves that we have in our interactions with others. Perhaps then social media are part of the evolutionary communication development and our search for connection, and help us to maintain contact with others in ways our ancestors could not. Yes, it's possible we can be used and abused. That was the name of a little furniture store where I went to graduate school in Oxford, Ohio. Miami of Ohio. Yeah, we can be used and abused, but there's much of the upside to all this as well. And Paul doesn't question the upside. He just thinks, do we really want to do that? So we can open it up and leave you plenty of time to get into Paul's work.
So I'm happy to be told that everything that I said was utterly extravagant. Whatever you say, it's okay.
Questions? Comments?
Yes?
I have one, but I want to give the students a chance to talk first.
But they see me in a completely different context. You know that it's extravagant. I try to be right,
I think
not
it's,
just entertaining.
I think it's interesting because a lot of this privacy versus security context comes from like a post 9/11 like scare sort of, is my opinion. And like we see one example of that is in airports. There's a lot of there's like take your shoes off and all that, and from people from my generation, we don't see that as I don't see that as like a terrible thing or something lost, like your personal privacy is lost. It's just something we have to do, and yeah, I don't know if do you see it that way or?
Not so much the airport business, but the sense that I can't be lost now. Every once in a while, they'll think that I can't be lost. I mean, Apple always knows where I am. I can always be found. Once they're pointed out to you, there are hundreds of security cameras around campus. It's except in the bathroom, for reasons that I don't quite understand. They're not in the bathroom yet, but you explain. They're not there. It's not really possible to do things privately. You can't get away with anything. That's not one of the things particularly. But what if I did? What if I did want to get away with something? I couldn't. You know, I'm always on guard. I'm making a joke about this, but there is something about being perpetually watched. And I every once in a while, I'll break out of my self. I am being followed. I'm being watched. And by three of the world's largest companies too. I'm not just talking about the government, which in theory we could do something about. In theory. But these I mean, I think I'm allowing the various tech companies to, just because it's convenient to do what they will with what I purchase and where I go, who I talk to, and etc. So yeah, it is disturbing to me, but I think it's because I'm of the phone booth era. So this is a hard sell for me. I mean, it's just very weird. It's just all very, very strange. And it's like, you know, if you've studied another language, if you've grown up speaking a second language, or a second language is your own, but if in adolescence or adulthood you start to learn another language, you never can get rid of it. You never speak with native fluency, never. I can't speak this language with native fluency. I'm comfortable. I prefer the phone booth.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, I mean, John's question I thought was really interesting is, I mean, the way I took your critique is that we're not losing a self, we're multiplying selves, right? So if you think about all the various social media as something like occasions to develop a self, right? And so they all have their own particular guides and rules. But what I think you're often trying to do there and I say this as somebody who uses no social media, is you're trying to use the social media in a way that you understand your audience, and so you're in the rhetorical position of trying to make a communication act with your audience, right? And so that's part of the sort of finding my voice, right? I'm always interested in students who have multiple Instagram accounts, but I take it that's just another instance in which I have multiple rhetorical, I don't want to call them cells, but rhetorical moves I can make. And I think of that, so what's the threat there? I mean, if I'm a good modern literary person, the threat there is that they're all either phony or they're disintegrated, right? I don't, so my challenge is, so it strikes me those are the worries, right? I have multiple selves that are so fragmented, there is no center, right? And so I worry about disaggregation completely. And so I do things like, maybe I have an avatar, a username, and I go on some discussion forums, and I do some trolling, right? I like trolling the liberals, so I go on the WAPO, and it's one thing to do is go to a liberal media like Washington Post and see how far down are we talking about Trump, and it's like 2, 3, that's all we talk about. And so, I mean, I could see somebody who says, I like just going and tweaking the liberals and seeing what they do, but that's not really me, that's just this sort of persona. And so I guess the way I think about the problem of the self, because it's been coming for some time, right? The existentialists have the problem of finding your true self in terms of inauthenticity, which I think is also technologically oriented. But at least the problem's articulated, right? I need to somehow find a center to not be an inauthentic, going with the flow, doing what they say, right? I become what do they call them, a catcher in the rye? What do you call them, stiffs or something?
Phonies.
What's that?
Phonies, catcher in the rye.
What?
Phonies.
Yeah, phonies, yeah, okay, yeah.
So that was.
That's the literary fear. So I guess my question is, what's the fear now, right? If the fear of the literate self was to be a phony, not to develop a fully inner self, right, but to take up the various social roles and posturings that the mass media is telling me I should have, right? So I think of the existentialists are responding sort of to the first blush of mass media everywhere. We realize how powerful this is. And so my question is what's, if I wanted to sort of have the existentialist anxiety today, it's not that, right? And I'm just wondering, what is it, if that makes sense, right? I mean, if I have multiple selves on multiple platforms or whatever, do I just not care about
Is that worry? I don't want you to indulge your secrets, but I certainly don't have multiple selves.
Right.
Do you? Do you have multiple platforms?
No.
I'm going to ask my daughter this.
I would add that in today's culture, everything is brought up off of social media.
Right.
And so if you were running to be like a public servant or something,
Yeah.
that could come back to hurt you if you're like trolling liberals, depending on how insensitive.
Well, you just use a fake username, right? I mean,
Well, if it can be traced back to you.
yeah, we got to be a little bit more savvy than that, I think.
Yeah.
The way I was thinking about it when you were speaking is the difference between the private and the public self. And so every act of like creation of the self within another medium or another platform is the public self. And then your private self is just, I don't know, the self that you come home to at night. But
Is there such a self?
I don't know. Well, I think might be the fear, is that all we have is the public created self, the like fake self.
I mean, I do think that the notions of privacy in terms of inner outer, that's gone, right? I mean, because as you were saying, the cell phone's with me everywhere. My job doesn't stay at the office, and the benefit is I can wear jeans to work.
There are
right? Lots of
all
benefits.
manner of benefits
Yeah.
in this, yes.
But I'm wondering if this is another failure of where the moment we're in now is, how do we understand privacy if we have to abandon the inner outer, right? So the Fourth Amendment you showed there was clearly an inner outer, right? And so it's interesting to find these spaces that are not public or not purely private, these liminal spaces, and how the Supreme Courts and other laws have handled it, right? Like your car is both public and private in a weird way, right? The police need a certain level of either suspicion or permission to search it, but that doesn't make any sense on a digital platform, right? I mean, there is no inner outer. And so I'm wondering, to get at the issue you're trying to get at is maybe we just have an old-fashioned notion of privacy, which is internal, external,
Yeah, it's
which,
very old-fashioned.
which doesn't
it
fit.
seems.
I mean, there's a whole bucket of worries. You know, the fact that we have a constitution that frames it in that way, and we now have a digital, or we now have technology, that makes that a silly distinction. So I'm wondering if you think about this, or if anybody in the audience, if there's another distinction we could have to talk about privacy rather than inner and outer, since that's been technologically obliterated.
You know, I've heard it described as maybe privacy is the wrong way to view it, this difference, is the fear of exploitation of our data. And that's how we should be thinking about privacy now, and instead of using that label. And the idea that we give up so much to the tech companies in terms of what they can do with the information they know about us, and in terms of even marketing some ads to us when they think they understand our mood based on our behavior. And I also tend to see the convenience of being able to read email at home after hours also is not necessarily a good thing. The idea of the former separation in terms of workload and work quantity, and being able to realistically get through too many email. Also a change in when I saw the notice about this meeting about the cyborg and the idea of how lives have changed so much, not just privacy but also intensity of volume of email to read.
Many dozens a day. I'm struck by the informality that happens. I'm certainly part of this. Sixth generation is all this to a certain age. Every once in a while, I'm inclined to wear a bow tie to work. Dress like a professor instead of an aging student. There are just all kinds of wonderful things that come with this. You know, we don't have to be buttoned up all the time in those awful clothes that we used to wear. But the formal distinctions, the campus, this is where I spend my life on the university. All of us do. You guys are just passing through. The rest of us have been here for decades, and I don't know that I've noticed any particular changes in the almost 3 decades that I've here, but it's dramatically different than when I was a student. And what I'm told student life was like 20 or 30 years before I was a student. But I think this extends outward. The only people that I know that have titles now are medical doctors, and even they, I think they're slipping away. But I don't think there's another title anywhere. But there used to be. We all had formal titles 20 years ago.
Do you think as people are more exposed to everybody else's private life that we're realizing that we're more similar than different?
Oh, that's the good part.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Is it you can develop empathy, but you might not have an empathetic response to something that you might not have had.
Yeah, I see it in maybe even with the electoral process, that we're choosing people who do have faults in their past instead of people who are maybe so thought of as perfect in moral virtue. We're exposed to people's faults, but then we're almost seeing them as, oh well, that's just a regular person. People make mistakes in their life, and everybody probably has something in however old they are that could be criticized by someone. But I think more people are coming to terms with the fact that people aren't perfect, and that's okay. And we're seeing these similar, our private lives are so different.
I'm trying to see the pot. You're pointing out something that from this brave new world of which I'm now a part. I'm dragged into. Yeah, that's the good thing. Yes, we are much more empathetic people than we once were, I think, and I think that's probably has to do with this generation of rights that we've done in the United States for the last 20 or 30 years. It's an attempt, a real generous attempt to be empathetic to people who are not like oneself. Stuff that would have been regarded as just utterly strange 40 years ago.
I'm not actually sure that we're more empathetic, although, I mean, I do see your point that when you know vastly more information about individuals, it's harder to portray a fake persona, right? So you can't just have a public persona if you know everything about them since the time they went to kindergarten. And that ties in kind of with what I wanted to say, which was, it seems to me the progression is not to another kind of communal life in the way that there was before, but where the individual, it's kind of the exaltation of the individual, because as the individual becomes more and more public, where people post all kinds of things about themselves, or people are taking photographs of their lunch, right, and it's like, you know, who cares what your lunch looked like today? You see an imposition of the private self of these individuals onto a public audience. And so, and that the public audience in a certain sense is supposed to be appreciative and sensitive and to that exposition. And so you see that, I think, in the concern about political correctness, right? Where I should be able to expose everything about myself, and everyone else should like it, or should at least not say that they don't like it, which then imposes a limitation on their private selves, because they should be allowed to like or not like it, and even to express their difference in that way. So I was watching a video actually just today about the importance of play in the animal world, including in human socialization. And they pointed out how the interaction, the physical interaction of different play behaviors teaches young, including human young, right, how to behave socially and build social bonds. And it sets them up for success in the life they'll lead as adults. So contrast that for a moment with the parents who gave an electronic device to a child in mass yesterday in order to keep the child quiet, right? So the child is starting to scream because it wants to be entertained, right? It wants its interiority, its interior desires satiated, rather than learning this is a time where I need to be thinking about others besides what my desires are. And the parents, on the other hand, are not learning and developing the skills of parenting in terms of knowing what are the child's actual needs. Does it need to be fed? Does it need something else? And also to train children how to be able not to just be always driven by their desires to be entertained and pleasure, basically, right? So it seems to me that there's a huge breakdown in courtesy, which you pointed out, in which the behaviors that used to be like, okay, I need to think about how other people will experience me when I'm working with them. Yes, that can be taken to the extreme too. But there's also a certain sense in which, Bullock has a wonderful poem called Courtesy, in which he shows courtesy as an act of charity to another person, right? And I think that that's being lost in that kind of exaltation of the expression of the interiority of the private. So that was.
It is being. Things change. Things. Those of us. Well, I don't know if you're what particularly. Let me speak for myself. I feel like I'm a visitor from outer space. I can maintain, and I can speak this weird language. In fact, I teach it. I'm a computer science professor. I can speak this weird language, but it is utterly alien to me. But it is as if and there were. I didn't get to talk about this, but there was a lot of resistance to print in the 16th century. And they used the same. They used the same kinds of tropes that we use now. Reading books are going to make you stupid because you don't memorize things. Things change. That's what I've come to think. Things change. They just change. And all of this informality that I am having such trouble with, struggling to think, well, this is just a new culture being born. I'm just a visitor.
Well, I
Maybe
think,
not too much longer.
I think it's important though that you make a judgment about whether that's a good thing or not, because you've experienced something that, and this is true of each generation, right, that they have to experience something that the younger generation hasn't. And if you don't teach people the good that you learned, if you don't pass on that wisdom, it's going to be lost. That doesn't mean that the culture has to remain entirely the same, but the good that you achieved over a lifetime is lost if you don't pass it on. And technology still remains a tool of embodied human beings, right? And so if there are important ways of interacting between the presence of one embodied person and the presence of another embodied person, which I think the one point of that you had up there when you spoke about presence. When people aren't educated, that is socialized, right, just in human interactions, to know how to engage those presences, and it's always mediated, they're going to lose something very important to their own identity and life as a human embodied person, which they cannot escape.
But I tend to
Even
believe
if they
that.
ignore
I
it.
tend to believe that. I tend to agree with that, but I want to keep quiet about it. Because I think that, well, I want to ask this question. Now we're on to this. I'm acting.
Paul, what exactly would you say you agree with?
I'm in utter agreement that much has been lost with the enormous changes that have gone on in the last, mostly 20 years. Much really has been lost. But that's my point of view. You know, I mean, I'm just from another era, so I don't get to comment on those things. But I'm acting as if I have no control. I'm acting like an utter technological determinist. Don't you think? Did you hear that in everything I said? Yeah. You know, there's this technique, and you put the stuff in one side of the engine, and out comes a cultural effect.
But we want to use them. I mean, we use the technologies and we become what they make us, but we still want to use it. So, I mean, I would think Ong is more balanced on that than determinists.
He always, you see it in his writing. He's always, people have accused him of that all the time. That he was a technological determinist. That he was giving really too much weight to technology.
Yeah.
In fact, humans have much more control of technology as used. But I think he is. I think he really is. I think he really is subtle as he is.
But Paul, what is the thing that you just said? You're sure we've given up a lot of things, but they bother you, some of these things that aren't there. Even though we have a repository now for most things, you're not putting them in the repository, or you think
no, it's not that.
As a culture we don't care about that anymore?
No, I think, I'm sorry, what is your name?
Lyra Pitstick.
Yeah, it's Lyra. It is what Lyra. And by the way, I address her by her first name, as she did me. This would not have happened, even 30 years ago. I would never have called somebody by their first name. First, I would have scoped out your position in the hierarchy and addressed you by appropriate title. But we're all friends now. So that's a good thing. Don't you think that's a good thing? We're all just pals here. So my students are not afraid of me. Are you afraid of me?
Yeah.
I was terrified of my professors. I was afraid of them all the time. Right? So this is a good thing. I'm happy. I give up something. I give up a lot, as a matter of fact. For this, I give up what surgeons still have. You know, we're all afraid of surgeons.
Fear is an accidental feature of respect hierarchies, though. I mean, it's possible that can be a feature of it, but that it's not certainly not a necessary feature. I was wondering about, I mean, a lot of what you said, especially when you're talking about the medieval era, it's the development of interiority that a written text allows. So you initially have a solitary engagement with a written text that cultivates a kind of interiority, and then, as you pointed out, it even becomes sort of it becomes a project of developing and cultivating a self when you think about memoir and diaries and so forth. It seems like you could say a corollary of lack of privacy is a willing surrender of interiority, such that what technology allows us is an increasingly rich array of venues for exhibiting selves, but no self to exhibit in those venues.
Well, that's a kind of a wonderful thing. You know, that's what Christopher Lasch complained about 40 years ago in what was called the culture of narcissism. So as it happens, you know, we think of narcissism popularly as this attention on the self, but clinically, I'm told, it is the sense that there is no self, that there is no there inside. I like that. You put that very nicely. I'm going to inscribe that on my door.
Well, but that shows, I mean, the reason I'm thinking in these terms is I'm thinking like, already Kirk mentioned this connection to existentialism and the quest for authenticity. Of course, what that suggests is yes, unless you are a technological determinist, we have some power to resist and say, I will not become reduced to a series of artificial self-presentations. And that might mean something like you were suggesting, there's a self that I retreat back to in my home that is my ultimate self, or something, or my real self, my point of reference. And even if our culture and technology press against that or push against that, it seems like we can voluntarily decide to cultivate a self that's independent of that. I mean, I think it's interesting to go back to what you said about evangelicals talking on the radio. I mean, actually, they're presenting a self because it's on the radio. They're doing there's a kind of performance there. But of course, if that's grounded in a self in the privacy of his or her home, reading the text of the New Testament and struggling with what does it mean and how do I apply it to myself. And of course, you can put that in religious terms, but you can put it in secular terms too. I mean, you have the solitary self at home reading the text of Heidegger and trying to make sense of what does it tell me, what does it reveal to me about myself and my placement in a complex culture. So do you see prospects for accepting the tools of technology and yet resisting by saying, in this respect at least, that I choose to cultivate a self independent of, or not independent, but at least distinct from multiple self-presentations in digital format?
It is certainly true that after human beings began producing books, they didn't stop talking. They just maybe talked in different ways. And so I think that I believe that private self, that self that we have, is probably still there. You know, it's probably still there for all of us. It's hard to know. We can't know that. I can't know that. I'm just guessing that you guys all have it. There's this weird little voice that I'd like to shut up most of the time. It's forever talking to me. I wish it was. Do you have that voice? I wonder if you have to be born, if you have to be a post-war baby. All the other people are dead. We post-babies are still here. We all have this little voice that's all talking to. Do you have a voice that's talking to you?
Everybody's
I'm
saying
asking.
no.
No, you don't have it. You have multiple voices talking. Mine is the same. And when I read what I write, it is what I might have written 40 years ago. But it is the same voice, and it's been untouched. It's been there for a very, very long time. Is that still the case? That's a silly question.
Maybe.
You have to ask your therapist about that.
Are you talking about just like thoughts throughout your thinking, or what do you mean by your inner voice?
Hey, there's a voice. There's a voice that talks to us. There's a voice that talks to that voice too. You get pretty crazy about
You
that.
talk to yourself.
Yeah, you talk to yourself.
Yeah.
So you remember that Saul Bellows novel, Herzog, so from it's a great novel. So there's this character, he's always walking around and he's addressing letters to the editors, writing partial addresses to the letter. And they're always rejoinders for slights that he's received. He has this clever repartee always going on in his letters. Well, you don't need that anymore because you can write comments all the time. You don't have to do that. But that really resonated with me at the time when I read this when I was young, some years ago. That I have partially formed letters in my head all the time. Letters always that I'm writing or have written or that I never write. I guess this is getting a little too much, isn't it? Let's go to the private life of geeks. Yes.
I have a question more directed on your paper. So the difficulty with studying the history of communication is you're stuck with basically written record, right?
Yeah,
And
isn't that a problem?
Well, yes. So I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, like, prior to the development of writing and things of that nature, shouldn't we think that people had an oral poetry that, that's, right, Genesis, right, but there's oral poetry,
Yes.
there's a written poetry.
Oh, yes, and that's what makes poetry, I'm sorry.
But then if there's poetry, there's an interiority. And likewise, because that's an expression, poetry is the personal digestion of expression or the personal digestion of an experience, right, that is then expressed. That's not a photograph, that's not that's filtered through somebody's voice. And likewise with the intention, in the Greeks and the medievals, to the notion of intention in the analysis of the moral act. Intention's not a public, is not a public thing. So I think although it's undeniable that with Descartes and Luther and modern modernity, right, you develop the self on steroids. And that's kind of why I say that's kind of, to me, continues in nowadays. It's not the loss of the self. It's the propagation or the disbursement of the self, but maybe to the point where that interiority, like if everything's going outwards, you don't have a center any longer from which to radiate. So like I was thinking, is it Socrates or Aristotle, I forget, who talks about happiness? And if happiness is things like riches or fame or even those things that give us pleasure, then our happiness is located outside ourselves. And we cannot say that we are happy when our happiness is located outside of ourselves. So when people become put in a situation of despair because they have fewer friends on Facebook, than they think they ought to have, their happiness is located outside of themselves, and then they've lost that sense of self and interiority. That is the sense of richness that would draw friends to them.
I'm struck by what you said about poetry being an expression of the self. I think that's a very modern notion.
Well, I'm just saying, insofar as poetry is verbal, right? You can't have poetry without words. Those words come from the mental word inside some person, right? But I don't see words floating around in the universe. I don't see the word heaven, written across the stars. So I pick a word that expresses what my experience is.
Well, I'm guessing that early poetry were collections of folk tales that some particularly talented singer over time, singers over time gathered together, and they were collective productions. The idea that there's a single poet, like Emily Dickinson saying, "I'm nobody, you are you," is a very modern idea. I think it's a written idea. We talk about poetry being written but it's very modern. Before the Renaissance, it was spoken, certainly in classical times. It was spoken. It was a much the way. I think this is what Owen got onto this idea about secondary orality. He was listening to a lot of pop music on the radio. I really heard this in the 50s and 60s, and this was weird and disturbing to him. And there seemed as if there was this kind of collective culture that was emerging. It wasn't the product of an agonized self, but it was kind of emerging collectively. And too bad he died too early. That was all about this.
We're a bit over our time,
Okay.
but I hope you'll stick around and continue the conversation. We have our next meetings of the Socratic Club are on November the 5th. We have a speaker who's continuing our series on Pope John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. And then on December the 3rd, Dr. Rosemary Volbrecht, who recently retired from the philosophy department, is going to give a last lecture. So I don't know what she's going to talk about.
The
but
last
it
lecture.
should be interesting. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.